Hey growth marketers, thank you so much for joining me for emergencies, emails, and everything in between. How to market your brand through a crisis. Now, I know that this isn't what you were expecting when you decided to come to Activate Live. You were probably hoping to network with people and see people in person, but fortunately, we can still do our work from the comfort of our own homes and stay safe that way. And so I'm really grateful that you are joining me for the next 30 minutes. Now, I don't know you personally, but I have a feeling I know the type of person you are just based on you showing up to this talk today, because it says a few things about you. It says that your brand has a plan, because if it didn't, you'd be on multiple Zoom calls trying to figure out what the strategy is to continue selling your products and services to your customers. The fact that you showed up here shows that the brand has figured out a strategy on how to move forward during this unprecedented time, and that you're just here to pick up some tactics on some emergency and crisis messaging. It also says another thing to me. It says that your personal life is in order. Now, you probably weren't expecting to homeschool your kids or that toilet paper would run out at the store. And those are the types of things that take up a lot of time. These emergencies are unprecedented, they're unexpected, and they can throw our normal routines for a loop. And so the fact that you're here for the next 30 minutes tells me that, you've cleared out some space to really spend some time figuring out how to message to your customers during this emergency. And then the last thing it tells me is that you're in fight mode. And if you look at disaster psychology, you're always reading about fight or flight. Obviously, flight is, run away, hang out on your couch, watch Netflix and watch Tiger King, whatever that is. But you're in fight mode. You're here to make the most of your social isolation time and really figure out how is it that I message to my customers in an empathetic and thoughtful way. And so, I'm just so grateful that you're here with me, and I'll take that time to just introduce myself. My name is Sophia Lay, and I, like you, hate disasters. Who likes these emergencies? Who likes crisis? And the fact is, I hate it so much that I spent 9 years studying how to prevent them. It took me on this long, windy path in disaster policy research. It took me to the 5th largest city in Washington state, where I led emergency management communications and outreach. And then something changed in me. I was able to do some great work there. I ran some award-winning campaigns. I got to be deployed to the Osa mudslide of 2014, but I could never figure out how to convince my constituents how to get prepared for an emergency. And the tools that I was getting in the government weren't particularly innovative or experimental, and so I quit it all. I taught myself copywriting from people like Joanna Wiebe and Brian Dean, and then luckily in my journey, I've been able to work with great clients like Iterable and Optimizely and Digital Marketer, and be able to take everything that I know about emergencies and apply it into email. And so obviously this all comes full circle. This is probably the first and only chance that I'll be able to talk about emergencies and emails. And so I see a lot of growth marketers struggling to find messaging that's particularly relevant to this situation. And so I just really want to be able to share a couple of my expertise and tips of just being in the emergency management scenario. And so we're going to talk through an agenda today. We're going to talk about the power of a single overriding communications objective and what that exactly means, otherwise known as SOCO. We're going to talk about 5 brands that are using SOCO, but they might not even know it. And then we're going to talk about what governments and nonprofits can teach you about cross-channel messaging. You know that part where I said that governments are innovative or particularly experimental? Well, when it comes to cross-channel messaging, they're actually ahead of private industry. So we're going to talk about lessons learned there and how to apply the single overriding communications objective to things like text message, social media, and in-app messaging. And if you stay with me for the next 30 minutes, you're going to get a gift. Unfortunately, it's not Justin Timberlake. The budget for Activate Live didn't really account for that, but you will get something as a way to wrap up and as a thank you for sticking with me. And with that, let's get started. Before I dive into what SOCO actually means, I really want to take the time to talk about mindset. Earlier, I talked about how you're probably in that fight mode, trying to figure out, how you can message better to your customers during this emergency or crisis. And it really takes a mindset shift. Because emergencies and crises, like I mentioned earlier, no one likes them. No one likes disruptions into their routine. But when you think of them as a dangerous part of, life, then you start thinking really shallowly. You start thinking in terms of, minimizing pain as much as possible, as opposed to thinking with, broad and spacious solutions. And so instead of thinking this way, I like what Stephen Fink says. He's the author of Crisis Management, Planning for the Inevitable. He says that a crisis is a fluid and dynamic state of affairs containing equal parts danger and opportunity. So yes, a crisis is not good. It can negatively affect a brand's bottom line, operations, but it can also become an opportunity that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Case in point, Jack in the Box. I don't know about you. I was a child of the 90s. We ate fast food like every week, and for whatever reason, Jack in the Box never came into our collective brains thinking, oh, maybe we should go to hamburger there. I was a McDonald's kid, but maybe there was a different reason. Maybe it was called E. coli. In the early 90s, Jack in the Box became known for not cooking their burgers to FDA standard temperatures, and therefore, 4 children died from E. coli, 600 some got sick, and it was a huge PR crisis for Jack in the Box, something that almost bankrupted their brand. However, it gave them a chance and an opportunity to do something different with their marketing. Case in point, Jack in the Box as the CEO. And so they ran a bunch of award-winning commercials of, Jack making decisions about products, firing employees, and then you couldn't drive around without seeing those Jack heads on car antennas. And so Jack in the Box really took this opportunity to do something different and really turn a crisis that was dangerous to their brand into an opportunity. And so once you understand that mindset and it shifts for you, then your messaging can come across as more positive, more empathetic, and honestly more creative. And so now that we've understood that a crisis is an opportunity, let's get into what a single overriding communications objective is. And so a single overriding communications objective really comes down to just asking yourselves 5 questions before you send out any message. This is not something that I made up. This is something that the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention actually came up with in order to help public information officers brief officials before they go on camera to talk to the media. Now, this serves 2 purposes. One, it helps customers or recipients of the message really get clear on what it is that they're trying to hear. And then it's also helpful for the people writing the message. I don't know about you, but if you're working 12-hour days for a few weeks at hand, it's going to get really grating after a while, and you're going to start to lose some mental capacity just because you're so exhausted and tired. And so in government, we're all about creating standard operating procedures. SOCO is just another standard operating procedure in order to craft a message during an emergency. And it really just comes down to 5 different questions. What is your primary message? What is it that you want your recipients to do? What lists or segments need to know about this? What facts or data points support this message, and then who is going to be the sender or the spokesperson of this message? And so I know that's a lot. I know that we need to dig into deep about what those points mean, and so I'm going to walk you through what each of those points are using emails from brands that we all know and love. So the first point of SOCO is figuring out what your primary message is. And I know it sounds simple, almost stupid, but these are things that you need to consider when you're crafting a message during an emergency. And it's because the people who are receiving the message, they are also in that fight or flight state. They are uncertain about their safety and their security, and they might gloss over details. An example, I'm in Washington State right now. They've been talking about moving from phase 1 to phase 2 for the stay-at-home order. And then I read it as, you can see 5 people outside of your home, and my husband read it as see 5 people outdoors outside of your home. So you can see how language can get really confusing, especially when you're in that flight or flight state. And so it's really important to really understand what that primary message is. Obviously, this example is not COVID-19 related. This is in relation to the Under Armour data breach of 2018. If you don't remember, MyFitnessPal had their database breached, and so hackers got a hold of people's names, email addresses, and then hash passwords. And so LastPass, which is a password-safe app, they did a good job of saying this breach does not affect your LastPass account. But if you keep reading further, they do follow the principles of SOCO. They talk about facts, they establish a spokesperson, but they just because of the formatting, the primary message gets lost. So you kind of have to read it a few times to really understand that, hey, this breach does not affect your LastPass account. A better way that they could have done it is by, adding a couple links to show, ways that they could, add more security or add two-factor authentication. But really what it comes down to is being really clear about what is that one thing that you want your recipients to get as a result of receiving your message. And once you figure that out, then you can kind of move on to other things, like what is it that you want your recipients to do? To email marketers or growth marketers, otherwise known as a primary call to action. And I love this example from Vanguard because it shows us that we can still sell during an emergency time while still being empathetic to people's wants and desires. And so in this case, Vanguard says, this is about retirement. This is about selling their digital advising program. And you don't see it in this particular email, but they talk about how navigating change is a fact of life. Markets go up and down, things change, but all throughout, your goals should still remain the same, which is to retire and become financially independent. And luckily for us, during disasters, those motivations don't change. People still want to lose weight. People still want to get healthy. They still want to get rich and become millionaires. And so Vanguard knows this, and based on their long history of being in the financial services industry, they know that this isn't the first time that we're in a recession. And so for them, it's really about, selling and being really clear about that primary call to action, which is, show us or, let us show you how Vanguard Digital Advising works. The third thing that we need to know is what lists or segments need to know about this. In CDC speak, this is about audience. For growth marketers, this is really about email personalization and segmentation. Now, I don't know about you, but it seemed that COVID-19 gave every marketer a chance to blast everyone who's ever joined a list in the history of their database. And while that might work because you think, well, it would be nice to tell everyone that, we cleaned the planes for once, but that's not necessarily a good thing because people are feeling like, hey, you kind of took me for granted. You show up in my inbox again. How dare you? And that's not really what we want as growth marketers. We want to be empathetic. We want to be thoughtful, especially during this emergency time. And so it's important to think about the lists and segments that need to know about the message that you're sending. In this particular case from Alaska Airlines, this is sent to anyone who currently has travel credits in their account, and it's talking about extending expiration dates. And I just love the language in here. That's incredibly empathetic. It says, we just want to make sure you have the flexibility and space to make the best decisions for you and your family. I mean, how empathetic is that? People don't want to travel right now. They're scared. They don't want to transmit, catch germs that are, in recirculated air. And so as opposed to the other airlines who are talking about, we don't necessarily want to refund your money, Alaska Airlines is doing it in a way that's saying, we'll just give you the flexibility for another 6 months so that you can do what you want to do. And obviously they didn't need to send this message to anybody. It was just important to send it to people that currently have credits in their account. And so that's a good example of how personalization, segmentation can actually help you during an emergency. The fourth thing as a part of SOCO is really understanding the facts and data points that support the message. Again, during an emergency, emotions are running high from people. They aren't really reading things or doing things in a clear or rational way. And that can actually affect the people that are creating the message as well. Again, as emergency managers or public information officers, we're not immune to emergencies. So having facts or data points helps because customers or recipients can't argue. You can't argue with facts or data. And so in this case, Madewell decided that they wanted to start making face masks as a result of COVID-19. Is Madewell known for making face masks? Not necessarily. They're known for making, cute, stylish clothes, and unfortunately they're not doing so well right now because their parent company just faced bankruptcy. But what an opportunity that they took in order to, provide value to their Madewell Insider email subscribers. And so in this case, they're not only just saying, we have face masks, but they actually break down facts and data points about what materials we use to craft the mask. And they're saying, these are not necessarily medical grade. We wouldn't recommend nurses and doctors wear them to perform surgery, but it is helpful to wear at the grocery store or places where social distancing can be tricky. And so having facts and data really helps bring a message to become more effective, especially during an emergency. And the last thing is about figuring out who should send the message. And so when you think about sending and finding out who a spokesperson is, you have to think about who your recipients are trusting right now. And so trust can be established in two ways based on what Doug Levy in the Communications Golden Hour says. Trust can be established either through relationships and familiarity, meaning that, if it's someone that you know, you're more likely to trust the message. And if in absence of that, you can also use authority. And so authority can be established in two ways, either through a job title, so CEO or founder, or in public safety, we always defer to what people are wearing. So in first response, it's either, you always see a police officer or a firefighter wearing uniform when they're talking to the media. That gives trust to the recipients in some way. And, if one of those two things is probably good to establish trust, but if you want it to be even better, you can get both, like what Farm Girl Flowers did. And so the founder, Christina, is very well known to her brand as starting her business in her San Francisco apartment. And so she went to Instagram recently to talk to her followers about how COVID-19 had affected her flower operations and how she was going to probably have to lay off a bunch of workers if, customers weren't willing to make orders. And so apparently she got such a great positive response and, thoughts of, well wishes that she had to send a thank you letter, an email, to basically say, thank you so much for the positive outcome. And by the way, shop now if you really believe that, you need to send a bouquet in the future or what have you. And so in this case, it's actually paid off for Christina because she is the spokesperson for the message versus some other brands that I've actually seen who, defer to just using the founder and the CEO, but they haven't necessarily introduced themselves in the inbox. And so Christina doesn't necessarily have to do that. People know who she is based on Instagram, based on the media, based on the emails that she sends. And so in this case, it was a great choice to choose her as a spokesperson. And it's something that you should consider when you're doing emergency messaging. All my clients know that I am a stickler for figuring out who the sender is because it determines voice and tone and everything about the email. And so, to wrap up, the single overriding communications objective is part of something that the CDC uses in order to determine any emergency messaging that goes out. And it's something that growth marketers can also use in order to do their emails. I find that this framework actually works for any message, not just an emergency. And so it really comes down to 5 things. Figuring out what the primary message is. What is it that you want your recipients to do? What lists or segments or audience that you're trying to target? What facts or data points back up your key message, and who should be the sender or the spokesperson of those emails? Just 5 questions, and you can create an emergency message that is clear, concise, and bonus points for it to be empathetic as well. And so now that we understand how SOCO works and we've seen how 5 brands are using it in their emails, let's talk about what governments and nonprofits can teach you about cross-channel messaging. Like I mentioned before, the government isn't particularly known for being innovative or experimental, and actually they haven't really bought into email as a channel. But in terms of text messaging and in-app, they are all up on it. The city that I worked at, they had an app where, people, constituents could message. Text messaging was a big thing. And so you can still apply SOCO to cross-channel messaging like text messaging, but there are a few things that you need to keep in mind. The first thing is really understanding your character limits. From the National Weather Service, you see that it says flash flood warning, this area till 6 p.m., avoid flood areas, check local media. Look at how concise that message is, and it's for a reason. Usually the software that they're using to do this text messaging, they have the job of trying to figure out what everyone's character limits are based on their cell phone carrier. And so typically a rule of thumb is that you have to get it within 90 characters or not, otherwise your message breaks and then it sends a second text message. My old boss learned that the hard way when he sent a message in our platform and then, accidentally checked that also send a text message. This was originally for email. And then he got some pretty annoying phone calls later on from people who were getting tens and dozens of text messages that were going backwards. And so it's important to apply SOCO. And, obviously this particular message from the National Weather Service has a primary call to action, a key message, a spokesperson, but you do have to be mindful of your character limits. The second thing that we want to do is making sure that you can always send an update. So in the example earlier, for like a flash flood event or something weather related, it's not typically rapidly evolving. But if you're looking at an event like an active shooter, obviously things are going to be progressing very quickly. And so governments, and particularly law enforcement, has really bought into the idea of social media because it gives them quick updates that are faster than press releases, and lots can change in a few minutes. And so unfortunately, Nova Scotia was faced with an active shooter event a few months ago. And so this is a snapshot from Twitter of how they're using social media in order to alert their public about what's going on. And so you see that it still follows the SOCO principles. There's always a primary message. There's always a primary call to action. And then the listing and the segmentation and the spokesperson thing, those things are already taken into account because of the way that the platforms are set up. And then obviously there's facts. So you can see that you can still apply SOCO even in just 280 characters or whatever it is that Twitter is. I'm old school. I still think that they have 140 characters. And then the last thing is making sure that you have a single call to action, especially when you're doing something like in-app messaging where you can have a little bit more, design possibilities. And so in this case, disaster relief funds are always popping up during these emergencies, and COVID-19 is no exception. And so for Spotify, who really wants to support artists that obviously can't work during this time, they decided to, add something, a little pop-up message in their app, basically asking for donations and saying, if you donate, we'll match it. And you notice the big button and then the dismiss. And so basically, obviously this is on brand for Spotify. They're a music app. It's helpful for them to actually support the artists that eventually will stream on their platform, and then also make it easy for the users to decide. It's no big deal if they don't want to donate now. There's a dismiss button, but it's a great example of not only, having that primary call to action in text form, but also using design as a way to enhance that. And so we covered a lot today. We covered how a crisis can turn into an opportunity, and we talked about Jack in the Box and the E. coli scare in the 90s. We talked about a single overriding communications objective, otherwise known as SOCO, which is used by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention in order to create messaging that is impactful, effective, and, hopefully empathetic. We talked about 5 brands that are using SOCO, and they might not even know it. We talked through things from LastPass, Vanguard, Madewell, Farm Girl Flowers. And then we also talked about how governments and nonprofits can teach you about cross-channel messaging. We talked about character limits. We also talked about, being able to send an update if you need to, and then also the power of using a single call to action. And so you made it. You made it after 30 some minutes. Obviously, this is a lot for you. This may not be your first emergency that you will go through, but me and the team at Iterable decided to put together a white paper on how to build emergency and crisis campaigns. And obviously, this is has some extra stuff that I can't cover in 30 minutes, but I hope that you actually take it and use it as a guidebook when you're crafting your next message. And with that, I really appreciate you having me today at Activate Live. Thank you for joining me at emergencies, emails, and everything in between. I'll be in the chat later, and you feel free to ask me any questions. And if you're watching this later on, please feel free to reach out if you need some help crafting an emergency or crisis campaign. It would be my honor to serve you.